And greetings wherever you are across the Caribbean or beyond our Caribbean region. We welcome you to our Caribbean Bridges. This is where we have our common conversations about our common destiny. And this time, we're looking at volcanic activity in our region, and specifically, the latest news we're getting out of St. Vincent, the mainland that is, where the La Soufriere volcano is acting up, and that's putting it mildly. But we'll have a scientist along to explain exactly what is happening today. But we're taking the opportunity as well to look back to the major eruption that took place in Montserrat in 1995. And also just to bring you up to date and tell you some stories about volcanic activity in our region. It's a way of helping us be aware and be prepared for any eventuality, particularly in St. Vincent right now. But of course, let me remind you that there are more volcanoes in several other Caribbean territories, and even offshore Grenada. There's Kikum-Jenny right there. And Dominica has its fair share of volcanoes. And our friends in St. Kitts also know that they've got volcanoes right there, and Soto Nevis. But you'll learn more about that as we talk to the scientists today. But let me tell you who will be joining me across this region. In Barbados is Franklin Michael, who is a former permanent secretary in the emergency department of the Montserrat government back in 1995. He's here to tell us. Also joining us in St. Vincent, Jennifer Richardson-Herbert. She's a communicator. She's a friend of mine in the media business. There to tell us exactly what's happening on the ground. And talking about on the ground, Professor Richard Robertson. He's a Vinci. Exactly see what's happening. So if you hear his phone ringing, you know he's getting a message telling him about activity at the volcanic site. But let's first go to Frankie Michael, who of course has some stories to tell about the exact nature of the environment back then in 1995 when he was at first serving as the permanent secretary in the Premier's office. So Mikey and Frankie, good evening.
Good evening, Julian. Good evening, colleagues, and good evening, everyone. Julian, you will know this very well because Montserrat is one of those Caribbean countries that you have chosen to live and work in. And I think it's still one of your favorites. Montserrat, those days, was coming out of the recovery to Hurricane Hugo, and a lot of strides had been made. I was saying earlier on that it's one of your favorite places because it was an absolutely beautiful country. We're talking about verdant hills, we're talking about rolling slopes, we're talking about rivers, most of which are seasonal, raining themselves deeply into the landscape. Almost anywhere you went in Montserrat, you would have a spectacle. There was very clean water, very good roads, very good telecommunications. For a small country, we had a very high standard of living. That was the reality we had until the volcano hit us in 1995. And then in the course of about two and a half years, it changed dramatically to the extent where Montserrat has not yet recovered in developmental terms with regard to the replacement of infrastructure, with regard to the replacement of population, with regard to commercial and economic activity. Tourism is not what it was in those days. Agriculture is not what it was in those days. Even light manufacturing is not what it was in those days. And of course, yes, time has passed, but more significantly, Montserrat has effectively generations of its people over the course of 25 years. So that's just a very quick capsule. And I hope that as we speak later, we can get into perhaps some more of the specifics in terms of the effects and impacts.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Frankie, for that. Let me go, though, to the scientists, because I'm sure people are anxious to hear exactly what is the very latest on the ground there. And let's turn our attention then and welcome a man who's got to pay attention to the volcano, Professor Richard Robertson. Prof, you got time for us?
Of course. Yes, one of the things that we do, we have to ensure that the message comes out. So we have to find time for letting people know what's happening. And at present, the volcano, as I suspect most people in Montserrat and in St. Vincent, certainly the rest of the region know, has been having what we call an effusive eruption of magma onto the surface. An effusive eruption, which means material from beneath the surface is slowly coming onto the surface. And in the case of St. Vincent, is building what we call a lava dome. It's building a rounded mass of rock that looks like it's black, dark in color. It's steaming a lot. There's a lot of gas coming out of it, and it's getting bigger and bigger. At present, it's getting close to the size of a pre-existing dome that was in place in 79. And the effects of the volcanic gases has been particularly felt in the upper parts of the volcano where it's damaging vegetation. But apart from the activity in the crater and its immediate surroundings, where it's interacting in a very negative way, it's damaging vegetation, it's very smelly, and the gases could potentially be harmful, and it's very hot rocks. It's not impacting directly the lower flanks. So what we do is that we monitor it carefully, we put it in new stations, because we want to track the growth, and we want to be in a position where we could detect that the growth is moving from an effusive, relatively quiet eruption to an explosive phase, which would impact wider areas, I should say, outside of the crater and further afield. The villages, particularly, you mentioned lower flanks, along the lower flanks of the volcano, particularly on the eastern side.
Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to come in here and follow up on the professor and talk about where the volcano is in relation to population centers on mainland St. Vincent. Let's see if we can fix that. In the meantime, let me bring the professor back in, because since we're hearing from him, can you fill in there, Professor, exactly where the population layout is on the flanks of the volcano itself?
Okay.
Yes, of course. The Soufrière volcano occupies. Jennifer sounds like she's coming back in, perhaps.
Jennifer, you back
The
with
volcano,
us?
okay. The volcano.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, so the volcano occupies the northern 1/3 of the island.
Yes, I believe I am, but
references to
the professor could give you information. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay.
you join reference to Montserrat. The difference between St. Vincent and Montserrat is that the major population centers in St. Vincent are actually in the south, away from where the volcano is. So the volcano is occupying the northern 1/3, but the communities, and you have about 5 or 6 communities that could be affected a little bit more. You know, a lot. There are people who live on the flanks of the volcano, and just outside, and they could be affected, but they're not the largest. The largest population centers are in the south, while in the case of Montserrat, the volcano was essentially erupting where the largest population centers were. So it's different. So there are potentially people that could be affected, but there's a lot more space in St. Vincent to move people from the danger areas to the areas where they can be safe. While in Montserrat, if you move them, you can have done that, but in this case of Montserrat, you have been moving them. If you think of it this way, it's like if in St. Vincent, in Montserrat, it was like if the volcano was over Kingstown, and then you would have had to move people from Kingstown to the north. While in this case, the volcano is over the northern part of the island, and while they have people there, there's lots of opportunities to move people to the south. So it poses a danger, yes, it does, but there's a lot more options in terms of what you can do in terms of managing that danger, I think.
All right. Thank you, Professor. I will still try with Jennifer and talk about the particular areas themselves and how many people are living in those areas, etc. Jennifer.
Okay. Good afternoon again, everybody. Julian, good afternoon. And good evening to all the persons who are viewing. I just think that some
All right, we certainly having our difficulties with Jennifer there. Of course, these kind of connections are fraught.
But for the purpose of this discussion, I am Sylvia in St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. Now, with that,
All right, we certainly have a very difficult
Julian?
point there. All right, so let me just take Jennifer up here and give her a chance to sort out her connection. I suspect it's more an internet level at this particular point, and that of course is the kind of thing that we face from time to time as we try to hook up across the region with the internet services we are offered. But Frankie is listening to us and can hear us well. So let me bring Frankie back in here and talk about the population centers affected by the 1995 eruption. You had the whole of the South, and you also had eastern parts of the country as well to deal with.
Well, again, Julian, as I said, you know the situation well. In effect, and Professor Robertson, Richie, my colleague, you know, and friend of many years now, the volcano threatened the population centers in and around Plymouth, the eastern villages, the southern villages, and to some extent, the southwestern corner of the island where there were some very substantial housing developments like Richmond Hill, for example, and Foxes Bay and the village of Cork Hill. So you're looking at perhaps 60% of the population or close to it under direct threat from the volcano in 1995. And that made a huge difference, of course. The population then was about 10,500 persons. And effectively, it meant that as we had successive evacuations, and this is a point that I'd like to make, for those who are not familiar with what happened in Montserrat, I described it those days, and I maintain still, an unfolding disaster in that things got worse over time and reached a peak about 2.5, 3 years after the start of the event. So for example, when we first saw a volcanic vent, we didn't have heavy ash falls. When we got into several vents appearing, we still didn't have very heavy ash falls, pyroclastic flows, nothing like that in the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it unfolded over time and it threatened various populations. For example, the village of Long Ground was about maybe a mile and a half in a straight line from the volcano itself. So that village was immediately under threat. We occupied Plymouth despite evacuations and the environs of Plymouth for about a year and a half after the volcanic activities first happened. So that's what happened. It threatened different areas at different times. But when it got to the stage where we had these huge pyroclastic flows descending on Plymouth, descending on the east, and then Boxing Day 1997 wiping out the south, and see in that part of the island. If you go back to Montserrat now, if you know Montserrat, you know, for those who are joining us, you know what Montserrat was, and you go back to Montserrat now, and you see the south, the east. It's almost as if you cannot believe it's the same island. Because in Plymouth, you probably have about 15, a depth of 15 to 20, and Richie can probably give a more accurate picture. You have at 20 feet of material in what used to be town. You can't see the prison, you can't see the market. You know, only the buildings, and we had few of them, of course, that are 3 stories high or 4 stories high, you can now see. So that tells you, you're looking at maybe 30, 40 feet of material covering the town. The eastern side, if you go and look at what was the airport, you can only see the chimney now. You can't see the buildings, you can't see Spanish Point, you can't see all those villages. And so sometimes to understand the story, you need somebody who knew what Montserrat was before, when you're there to explain what you're not seeing. Because the whole point is, Julian, for the devastation that took place, it's not easy to look at photographs and see it, because you can't see it really.
Yeah, I had a chance to go back and look at my beloved South, where the Radio Antilles was located, and we went up the coast by boat. We went past, of course, the remains of Plymouth, and could see what was really the tallest building within that Plymouth area would have been John Bassey's building. Barclays Bank was there a long time ago, and of course the cinema, but nothing really that I could recognize from the days where I spent at least 10 years in Montserrat, etc. And then going all the way past Kinsale, what used to be Kinsale, really, and heading into the deep south, so to speak. I was amazed that there was nothing on the landscape to give an indication that any enterprise existed, any houses existed, etc. So I know what you talk about when you say that the depth of the material that is on Plymouth. I had a chance to walk into Plymouth and literally walking over all the buildings that were there before the volcanic explosion. So it's quite a different landscape. Richie, I know you've been there to Montserrat several times as well. I know you have your own impressions about what happened as a person, personally and professionally. So please feel free to share.
Yes, as Frankie would tell you, I was there before the beginning. I was there before the eruption started, and was involved off and on virtually for the entire eruption, and I'm still involved. So yes, Montserrat was particularly significant. More so, as Frankie said, it was an evolving crisis. At the beginning, we didn't really know very much because it hadn't erupted before. Montserrat Super Hills hadn't erupted in historical times. So in terms of the scientific knowledge of the volcano was not sufficient for us to know exactly where it would go. And then it slowly built up over time. So in fact, the damage that you see in Plymouth, in a sense, is symptomatic of what the eruption did. The damage that is in Plymouth now, the burial of Plymouth, say, happened over a period of time, just like the volcano sort of having an effect on Montserrat progressively over a period of time. So yes, I mean, it was amazing. I remember going into Plymouth the first time I went, and they had these nice. It was a beautiful town, man. And then seeing it progressively buried, it's something else. You as a volcanologist, as a geologist involved in the field, you're interested in these amazing phenomena we call volcanoes, and you monitor them because you want to minimize the impact on people. And yes, you get interested in what and there's the tear between that and the fact that you could see what they do to people and you see the effects of it, and you're excited about the eruption, but then you're not excited about the effect that it has. So it's kind of you would like to see an eruption, but you really don't want to see an eruption because of the effect it has on people. And that played out in Montserrat a lot because the scientific group lived close to the people of Montserrat. There was a lot of interaction with them, so we kind of felt what they were feeling a lot of times. And I think that was a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing because often you scientists have to be a bit insulated from that, and sometimes we weren't as insulated as we should be. But yes, I think any of us that experience Montserrat, it affects you in a way that affects how you do your job, in a sense. I think the way.
All right. So thanks, Richard. To come back to you again, we'll talk some more of the science, etc. But let's try one more time. As they say, I'm a glutton for punishment. Let's check with Jennifer, who is in Kingstown. Jennifer? Not sure why her audio disappears, but all we get is a great big smile, which is very welcome, I'm sure. But we certainly like to come back. I want to go back to Richard though and ask him about the whole matter of it is impossible to warn anybody when the eruption will take place. You said you were there before the eruption in Montserrat, and I know that this is the most difficult aspect of the volcanologist's job. As I talked to Dr. Rowley, Keith Rowley in Trinidad, who was also involved in looking at the Montserrat situation, etc. And I did send him a note today to say, I know if you were in the best of health, you would want to be on a show like this. But let's talk about the difficulty of prediction, because a lot of people just don't come to terms with the reality of how very difficult this is, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fact that it's this whole business of what we call uncertainty. I find it very interesting in terms of the current environment of COVID, that I think people have grasped the concept a little bit more, that in science, we try to understand how things are operating, but there's a lot of margin of error in what we do. And in the volcano science, we try as best as we can to, if you think of what we're trying to do, we have a mountain at the top, and we try and put in sensors on them to try to figure out what's happening beneath. It's not like it's a bit like a doctor that is trying to look at a patient, but all he can detect, or he or she can detect, is the outer skin, and he can't use all the probes that we have in modern science now, in modern medicine now. So it's limited what you could first of all, what you could detect. Is limited in terms of what we actually understand. In the case of Montserrat, the point I was making is that Montserrat hadn't done an eruption before, so we had very little record of how it had behaved in terms of eruptive activity. That is not the same for, say, St. Vincent. St. Vincent, we have had many eruptions, so we have a fair idea of how St. Vincent operates. The problem you tend to have is that despite there are cases where you might know a lot, one of the problems you have is that you can't be absolutely sure. And often we want to know, when we speak of predictions, we want to know that this thing is going to happen exactly at this hour, exactly on this day. And it's often difficult. Most often it's impossible to do that, first of all, simply because we don't understand the thing that we're studying completely. We haven't reached that stage yet. We may one of these days, we strive for it. And because you can't tell them that, it doesn't necessarily mean we can't tell them that it might happen. So, for example, I can tell you that there are many volcanoes in the region that could erupt. But unless, Frankie will tell you that, unless we could tell them exactly when or what is going to happen, it's difficult for administrators to take action. And often, despite the best science, despite knowing that, for example, so in Montserrat, we weren't absolutely surprised that Montserrat erupted. We weren't absolutely. Because Montserrat had done several things, but it just had never gone to eruption. It had done several other things. So therefore, to know that, and then having I understand the difficulty as an administrative authority to then, based on what we're saying, take certain definitive actions. And that's the struggle, because people want a certain amount of certainty that they can't have. They can't deal with the uncertainty. Yet we do it all the time. When we drive a vehicle, we take a chance, right? But we don't want to do it to the volcano.
Yeah. Which then brings me to bring to Frankie back in here now and talk about the response, because talk about that point at which you had to make the decision about a major evacuation.
It comes down to faith in the judgment of the scientists based on their knowledge of the totality of the situation. Now, I recall Richie says, and I agree with everything Richie just said, that scientists can't say exactly when a major event is going to take place. But let me go back to a couple of things. In Montserrat, on one occasion, we went to the village of Long Ground, scientists, ourselves, all the officials, and we engaged with them because the scientists thought there was likely to be an event that could threaten Long Ground. That was April 1st. The people were requested to leave their homes that very evening, Julian, April 1st. Now, of course, some people decided Saturday and some people want to fool us and so on. So we had to get over that too. But they left. This is where people said, look, I'm not leaving. But thankfully, you know, if we have time later on, we can come back to them. But on April 1st, the scientists said, look, we think there's going to be a major event. We can't say when. And Julian, Richie, I don't know if you remember, it was April 1st, 2 days later, there was a major event. Now compare that, Julian, with what happened on Boxing Day, 1997. A year before that event, the scientist says, look, if this volcano is explosive over the south, if it tops the southern wall, and if there's a lateral blast, there could be an event in the south. It did not happen for a year, Julian, but when the scientists said it should be taken out of the south, we took the decision that the evacuation should take place. And of course, there were a lot of angry people, very angry people. You're taking us out of our comfortable homes and you're putting us in some very uncomfortable shelter conditions, etc., etc. We lived through all of that. But I will tell you, when I went over the south of the island in a helicopter the day after Boxing Day, and I saw what had happened, Julian, the south that you know very well, you could only see 2 old sugar mills and the floors, Julian, not the buildings, the floors of 2 churches. Everything else had absolutely disappeared into the sea. Bear in mind, I said that the scientific recommendation had come a year before the event. And we asked people to come out of those areas a year, not a week, not a day, not a month, but a year. And we had to take the blows for asking them to come out, and they couldn't see the immediate danger. So that illustrates the nature of the relationship. And I know Richie was saying earlier on that the scientists became involved. The scientists are part of the team. I don't know, Richie, if we could say this here. I should even say this here. But Julian, when we had any little sort of social activity, it was everybody involved. The scientists were involved, the police were involved. When we tried, as we call them, to have a little stress buster here and there, the scientists were an integral part of that. So we became a family, a professional family, yes, but a family because we are all working towards the same end. And Montserrat has a whole host of challenges still, and we had a lot of difficulties then, and none of us who were involved is ever going to tell you we got it absolutely right, and we were totally perfect about everything that we did. But we will always tell you that teamwork and our effort together on all sides was something that I think we can all be proud of.
Well, I have to tell you that when the eruption occurred, I was not in Montserrat. I was in Barbados, and I cried like a child thinking that my whole beloved Montserrat was gone. So I was quite relieved sometime afterwards to be able to recognize that really the area of greatest impact was the south and of course eastern parts of the island. But I want to ask you, Frankie, to talk about the difficulty of managing people, because you did make reference to it. But I know that there was an area there where people had a lot of farming going up east on the drive up to the airport. And unfortunately, they didn't heed the scientists and the authorities' warning, and we lost about 19 people there. Can you talk about that? I know it's sad, but I think it needs to be used as an education moment, a teaching moment for people who should heed the word of the authorities.
Julian, it is particularly sad, and for someone like me, I knew virtually everyone, and certainly the members of my family. I'm married into Montserrat, so to speak. I'm native Antiguan, but married into Montserrat. And my extended family in Montserrat knew every one of the persons that lost their lives on that day. I knew perhaps 2/3 of them. Now, it was particularly painful for us for several reasons, not the least of which was one of the goals of the response was not to lose lives directly to the volcano. In other words, doing the best we could to ensure that the evacuations took place ahead of major events. Now, remember that the areas, for those who don't know, we can just explain, as you were saying, in the places where people lost their lives, those areas were officially evacuated. In other words, those were already regarded as too dangerous for occupancy. So it isn't that we were areas where the deaths occurred. The simple reality, and it's a difficult choice, and we're seeing the complications of this now, as Richie said before with COVID, life and livelihood. Think of the number of people in the United States, as we understand it, who had to work on public transport, who had to work on trains, who had to work on buses. And if they didn't turn up for a day's work, they wouldn't get a day's pay. Think of that in terms of some of the people, not everybody, because there are different cases. There was one guy who, unfortunately, he just left the airport to go back and check on his house and had horrible, horrible bad luck when the pyroclastic flow came down. But think of those who are caught in the farming areas who had crops in the ground and thought, look, I can get one more crop out of this, so I can get a little income from this. And it illustrates the challenge when we have these major events as countries and governments. Can we find ways and means of ensuring that people are supported through these difficult financial times so that they don't have to take exceptional risks as many of our folks took on that particular morning? I remember the morning as though it was a I saw one or two people headed in that direction, and my heart fell because scientists had already said, and I can remember Norton Anderson, one of the scientists, when the event started happening, Richie, at the observatory. I don't think you were with me at that time. Norton said,
I know, but
if there's anybody in the Farrells area right now, they are dead. Julian, when he said that to me, you can imagine how it felt to me, because don't forget, prior to all of this, I worked so that my involvement in farming and with farmers was a very deep professional and personal involvement. My mother-in-law was one of our most celebrated farmers in Montserrat. So when you put all of that together, it's a very painful thing for all of us to know that we had loss of life. But as I said, I emphasize, it isn't that the system didn't work, but some human beings were making a difficult choice in livelihood, trying to get a little bit more income. Others were sheer bad luck. One or two said they couldn't take conditions in shelters. They preferred to be in their home, even with the risk, perhaps maybe not getting to grips with the level and extent of the risk.
Fair enough. And I just put a point in there that that Frankie is really an agriculturalist at heart and by training. He's one of those people who graduated from the University of the West Indies and worked his way up to become Director of Agriculture in Antigua and in Montserrat, sorry. Let me make sure about that. But I want to bring, I think you gave me a good link into bringing the professor back in here, Richie, and to talk about the invisible gases that people are not aware of if you have a major explosion and pyroclastic flows.
well, as it is now, in fact, one of the major environmental impacts that you have from the volcano, even in its effusive stage, is the emission of volcanic gases. Volcanoes emit lots of gases. In the context of the Soufriere volcano, and even the Soufriere Hills volcano, one of the major components, apart from water vapor, which is the dominant one, is sulfur-rich gases, either things like hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide. Now, often these have a particular smell. You could smell sulfur and you could tell that it's there. It has different particular kinds of smell, but you do have other kinds of gases. You have gases that are rich in fluorine, and sometimes you have gases such as carbon dioxide, which you can't actually smell. Now, my point is that they come out all of the time. It doesn't have to be exploded. They come out as I'm speaking now at La Soufriere. There are volcanic gases coming out. The fortunate thing is that they often get diluted as soon as they come out. They get mixed with the oxygen, and therefore the concentrations are usually insufficient other than where the gas is coming out. In the crater, in the case of Soufriere, or quite close to the crater floor in the crater rim and the top parts of the volcano. By the time they wave themselves, find their way down slope, they're usually dilute enough that you will smell them, but they're not going to cause you too much harm. In an explosion, when you have explosive activity, yes, you have a lot more gases, but what comes down often is these things that they call pyroclastic flows, or flows of hot, fragmented rock and gases that move down the mountainside very fast and destroy everything. And that's the thing that's most dangerous from explosive eruptions such as ours. The rapidly moving mixture of hot ash, gas, and fragments of rock that pulverize itself. You spoke about Radio Antilles, you spoke about destruction in Montserrat. A lot of that is from these pyroclastic flows, which has gases in it. So the gases are usually can be dangerous, but in the effusive case, when the volcano is just created a dome, as it is now in St. Vincent, as it did for a long time in Montserrat at different points, the gases come out, but they often mix, and therefore they don't become too much of a problem unless you live very close to them, or you are standing very close to them. And in the case of St. Vincent, right now it's the crater floor and the crater rim. And that's why we advise people not to be there. When you get further afield, they become less so. But despite that, we still have to monitor for them, because sometimes the concentrations could peak up, and we need to make sure that we know what's happening. And that's one of the things that we monitor for, the emission of gases.
I'll stay with you one more time, Professor, because I know you have a lot of equipment in the vicinity of the volcanoes that you're monitoring across this region. But you talk about the difficulty of predicting, but you are getting what you call swarms over a period of time. Isn't that some stronger indication of a possible eruption?
Well, yes. One of the main ways in which we monitor volcanoes is by looking at what we call seismicity, earthquakes. Volcanoes, as prior to their eruption, they cause, because they're moving masses of rock underneath the surface that's sort of solid, not quite solid as much as when they get to the surface. But as they move, they have to push earth away, push rocks away. And in doing that, they shake the ground essentially and create earthquakes, volcanic earthquakes. And if we have instruments in the ground, we can detect that. So one of the ways in which we can detect that activity is happening, that magma is trying to get to the surface, is by looking at volcanic earthquakes. But when you're monitoring, you can't depend on just one signal. So you tend to have a number of different data points. So if you just see elevated seismicity, it tells you something, magma is trying to get to the surface, but it doesn't tell you if it will get to the surface or when. So you tend to put more instruments in. In our case, in Tunisia, we're putting in instruments that monitor whether the volcano is swelling up, which we use GPS, Global Positioning System, to tell the swelling. And also we monitor the emission of gases, because the gases that come out tell us something about what is happening. So you have to use different techniques, and you combine them, and depending on what they combine as, what they tell you as they combine, you can then make a prognosis about what is likely. So elevated seismicity is one thing, but it is not, and it can't be the only thing. And we have elevated seismicity at all the volcanoes from time to time. We've had in Dominica, we had in Tunisia prior to this one, and we certainly in Montserrat, well, Frankie will tell you, Montserrat had 30-year cycles of really intense earthquakes. And when the eruption happened, was another 30-year in one of those cycles. But we didn't know it was going to erupt for sure until, virtually it did.
But I know as you talk, as you point back to Frankie, there was a suggestion that there was information from some time ago, a British government study that indicated what the possibilities were of an eruption and what would be required in a response, in fact, to evacuate the entire island. You remember that, Frankie? All right. Well, that's the nature of the beast, so to speak. You can pick that up.
If you wish, because I'm familiar with the study. What happened prior to the eruption, and it's what happens at volcanoes. At volcanoes, we study them all the time, and the Seismic Research Center have always been studying them. So in the case of Montserrat, there would have been a study that was part involved Seismic Research Center staff, where we assess the volcanic hazard. What was the potential of this volcano erupting, and if it erupts, what it would likely to do. It's a famous report that's called the Wadge and Isaacs report that came out. And it's essentially said that A, this volcano can erupt, and B, if it erupts, it will affect a particular part of the island. And the part of the island that they said it would erupt, it essentially has, that it would affect, sorry, it essentially has affected. And so one can say in hindsight that, people knew and the government should have known before. But it comes back to the point I was making before, that even though they said this was a possibility, that you had a certain probability of it happening, and governments have to weigh lots of different things. So I could understand why they might have been, reluctant. I mean, I could frankly say I could probably critique them for perhaps not taking as much cognizance of the fact that they had a potential for eruption, but I could understand certain actions that they take. And it is a challenge that all governments have. I could critique them, but I think they could pay more attention to, and they should pay more attention to volcanic hazard. I don't think they do enough. But in terms of what exactly they do, I could understand why there isn't sometimes, I think there's a lot more that they can do and they should do. But I understand why perhaps there's not enough. For scientists like me, I think I would always be dissatisfied with how much they do, because there needs to be a lot more that can be done and should be done to make us safe.
Okay. I'm not sure if Frankie is back, but I'll try one more time to get Frankie's input here. Are you there, Frankie? All right. So we definitely have a problem with his connection. Again, it's been coming and going, and we did have an experience for a problem with Jennifer earlier as well, and we took her out because we tried it again and again. But I think this is the most interesting look. Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, if you're hearing me, I want to add to what Richie was saying with a dimension, which I was about to get. One of the realities that you have with highly scientific information in order for it to become the basis of decision making, it needs to be converted into a form that the non-scientists, okay, particularly those in the political realm, are able to treat with. Now, that's part of the challenge with a subject like volcanology. If you produce a typical scientific document and there is no management brief that accompanies it, you may not necessarily get the same political attention as you would get from other realities. Yeah. In addition, the situation in Montserrat was complicated by the fact you had a change of administrations. You had a change of administrations, you had a change of personnel. And in fact, going through experiences like this is one of the, in my, I'm still saying, we do not do a very good job of carrying forward concerns, issues, challenges, and proposals from one administration to the next when there is a change. So if, for example, there were 3 people or 4 people who were aware of the Watt and Isaacs report before the 18th of July, 1995, when the volcano started, they didn't make a particular point of drawing that to the attention of those who succeeded them, then you would not have the kind of carryover of discussion and information that you would want. And again, that was one of those areas which generated quite a lot of interest in Montserrat in terms of saying, oh, but Watt and Isaacs predicted that this could have happened. And as Richie explained, it wasn't a prediction in the sense of saying, well, this is what is going to happen during the course of the next few years. It was not in that form. And therefore, the decisions regarding management of the volcanic threat would not easily have been based on a scientific assessment in the form in which it was done at that point in time. And we should all know, and we've discussed this before, once that volcanic event, July 18th, the relationship between the scientists and the governing officials was such that there was one voice in terms of how we're moving forward.
I'd just like to add something to that, if you don't mind.
There we are.
That the Montserrat eruption certainly taught us at the Seismic Research Center. One of the key lessons was that we needed to put more effort in precisely what Frankie said, that we needed to put more effort in distilling scientific information in a way in which both the public and the authorities could. So we actually have an arm now of seismic, we call education and outreach, where we have a team of people and that's what they do. And in fact, I think you can see the amount of information that is coming out in the public in terms of what is happening now in St. Vincent is a reflection of that we actually have a team of people that do Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we do articles. They are constantly, they're a feed of people that we organizing interviews, we're managing, all of that is happening. And you could only have that if you push the effort to it. And I'll say that to a large extent, we can do it now because we learned that in Montserrat and we have put a significant effort in doing it. I hope that it means that the way in which we're managing things now, is much more transparent and people are more comfortable with it. We do get criticism and we understand that, but I think Montserrat could take credit for sort of teaching us that and the need for that. And I just like to enforce that that is correct. Frankie is quite right.
All right, so let's see if lessons are learned. Let's bring in our communicator one more time. Let's try one more time for Jennifer, who is in Kingstown, who has had some problems there in the connection. And she...
Yes, Julian, good evening.
Yeah, she's determined to get back in there, but for some reason or other, the gremlins are working against her. All right, so we've had quite a time looking at the current. Let me see if I give her a little space here. We're hearing you now, Jennifer. Go ahead.
Yes, you're not hearing me at all? Okay, great, good. And I am coming in just to say good evening to everybody. Apologies for the bad internet connection. But I'm coming at a good time where Richard is talking about the information that the people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are receiving at this time, which is quite good. Because of the flow of information that we're having now, persons, the Robertson and the Grenadines, and in particular those living in the red zone, they are able to prepare in advance. For your story in 79, I was first in secondary school, and before the Holy Thursday, when the volcano erupted, the good day, our entire school went to the last prayer. It was an outing for us. We went there, had a good time, saw the volcano, everything looked.
All right, we definitely have to.
Nothing at all. That volcano was, and I say that to say that had we been getting leadership of our school, the entire no one from the school was so lacking. 2 days before the eruption, no, we did not know anything. Okay, I guess you have.
All right, I think Jennifer has tried her best, but it is not her problem. It is a technical problem on the St. Vincent side there and in Kingstown. But we'll certainly try and set it up again and give Jennifer a better opportunity to talk about the situation on the ground in St. Vincent. So it's been very interesting to hear from Professor Robertson and also from Frankie. Of course, going back to the days of 1995 and the eruption. Real stories for sure. I hope that those of you who followed the details and stories we've shared with you will certainly be on guard wherever you are, because of course there are many volcanoes in many of the Caribbean territories, except Barbados for that matter, because of its coral formation. But so at this stage, let's keep our eyes and ears on La Soufrière in St. Vincent. I know that many other Caribbean territories offered help to the Vincentians, etc. And it's important, of course, to continue to pay attention to the science, not like other people who turn their back on science here. But we certainly have an outstanding organization at the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center to rely on for their knowledge of the history and, of course, of the current conditions as well. Let me thank Professor Richard Robertson for joining us, and also Frankie Michael, of course, looking back to 1995 and coming forward, and also for Jennifer, her patience and long suffering in the circumstances. So to all of you and to the team backing us here in our special look at volcano stories, that's a wrap. Until next time.
Thank you.